Hey everyone, welcome back to LGBT Stories. Today, we're diving into a heartwarming and emotional tale that will tug at your heartstrings. It's a story about unexpected connections, deepening bonds, and the moments that change everything. Get ready to feel all the feels as we explore a true gay story that will leave you thinking long after the video ends. Let's jump right in. One quiet afternoon in the kitchen blurred every boundary, igniting a connection between us that would change everything in ways I never anticipated. I had invited my nephew Alex to stay over for a few days. He had just graduated and was eager to experience life outside of his parents' house. So, I thought it would be a good opportunity for him to spend some time here, away from the familiar. I expected the usual late-night movies, sharing meals, and maybe a few conversations about his future plans. I didn't expect the quiet tension that began to grow between us. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was busy with one of my favorite recipes. The sizzle of vegetables in the pan filled the room with warmth, the kind of warmth that made a house feel like home. I was caught up in the rhythm of chopping and stirring when I noticed Alex standing by the doorway, watching me with a smile that was more thoughtful than usual. "Need any help, Uncle?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of curiosity. "Only if you're ready to take orders," I joked, smiling over my shoulder. He laughed and walked over, his footsteps uncharacteristically quiet, almost as if he didn't want to break the spell of the moment. Alex was tall, lean, and had a kind of natural confidence that reminded me of myself at his age. But there was also something more thoughtful in him, an intensity one hadn't seen before. His presence filled the room, and suddenly I found myself hyper-aware of his every movement, the way he stood close enough to reach over and grab a knife or pass me a dish. I tried to focus on cooking, but the air between us felt charged with something unspoken. So he began leaning against the counter. "How do you know when a dish is ready?" "It looks complicated," he said. "Patience," I replied, smiling. "The food lets you know when it's ready." He watched me for a moment, his eyes steady and thoughtful. "You're always so calm. It's like nothing can shake you," he observed, a hint of admiration in his voice. I laughed, a bit embarrassed. "Life teaches you that eventually," I replied, trying to brush it off, but something in his gaze lingered. There was a kind of silent understanding there, a curiosity that went beyond words. I busied myself with the food, focusing on the familiar task of cooking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Alex was seeing something deeper in me, something I hadn't shown anyone in a long time. For the next few minutes, we worked in companionable silence, him chopping vegetables and me stirring the pot. But every now and then, I'd catch him looking at me out of the corner of my eye, his gaze intense and unwavering. I told myself it was just his way of observing, of learning from someone he looked up to, but a part of me, buried beneath layers of habit and routine, felt unsettled. The next few days passed in a similar rhythm. We'd spend our evenings watching old movies, laughing, and sharing stories. He'd ask questions about my life, things he'd never thought to ask before, and I'd find myself opening up, telling him stories from my youth, moments that shaped me. There was a closeness developing, one that felt natural but also caught me off guard. One night, as we were watching an old action film, he suddenly turned to me, his face lit only by the flickering light of the screen. "Do you ever wish you'd done things differently?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes intent. The question surprised me. "Differently? How?" I replied. "I don't know," he said, shrugging. "Different choices, different life." I took a moment to think. Sometimes, I admitted, but life has a funny way of leading you exactly where you need to go. He nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "I think that's what I'm trying to figure out right now," he said quietly. The conversation settled between us like a secret, something only we shared. For a moment, I felt an urge to reach out and tell him that he didn't have to figure it all out alone, that he could lean on me if he needed to, but I held back, uncertain of where the feeling came from. That night, I lay awake thinking about our conversation, about the look in his eyes as he asked me that question. There was a vulnerability there, a rawness I hadn't expected. It was as if he was searching for something, some kind of answer that he thought I could provide. I felt a strange protectiveness toward him, a desire to help him find his way. The next day, Alex joined me in the kitchen again. We cooked side by side, exchanging stories and laughter, and I found myself relaxing in his presence, enjoying his company in a way I hadn't anticipated. As we worked, he reached over to grab a seasoning from the shelf, and his hand brushed against mine. It was a fleeting touch, but it lingered, the warmth of his skin startling me. "Sorry," he said, a bit flustered, his cheeks flushing. "No problem," I replied, forcing a smile and trying to brush off the feeling that his touch had left behind. But it was there beneath the surface, a subtle tension that I couldn't ignore. As the day went on, I found myself watching him, noticing the way he moved, the way he carried himself. I told myself it was just a passing thought, something that would fade with time. That evening, we sat in the living room, the sounds of the neighborhood quieting as night fell. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something I didn't quite understand. I turned to say something, but he was already looking at me, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "Uncle, I just want you to know I really appreciate you for everything," he said softly. The sincerity in his voice took me by surprise, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a sense of closeness I hadn't felt in a long time. "Your family, Alex," I replied. "I'm always here for you." There was a pause, a moment of silence that felt profound, as if we were both on the edge of something unspoken. For the first time, I wondered if he was feeling the same tension, the same pull that I was. It was a thought I quickly dismissed, but it lingered, refusing to fade. Over the next few days, the feeling only grew stronger. Every conversation, every shared laugh, every accidental touch seemed to deepen the connection between us. Though I tried to ignore it, to brush it off as a passing feeling, I couldn't deny that something had shifted. There was a quiet intensity in Alex's gaze, a depth that seemed to draw me in, making me question things I hadn't thought about in years. It was unsettling and thrilling, this feeling of being seen, truly seen by someone else. As much as I tried to deny it, I knew that things would never be the same. Alex had stirred something in me, something I couldn't explain, something that went beyond words. But I told myself it was just a passing phase, a fleeting feeling that would fade with time. After all, he was my nephew, and I was his uncle. There was no reason to think that anything more could come of it. At least that's what I kept telling myself. The days continued to pass, each one bringing a new layer of tension, an unspoken connection that seemed to grow stronger with every passing moment. I told myself it was all in my head, that Alex and I were just close, that he looked up to me in a way that made me feel proud. But deep down, I knew there was something different, something we weren't talking about. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the walls, we found ourselves in the living room, seated across from each other. It had become a habit, this quiet ritual of watching a movie together before bed, sharing popcorn, laughing at old comedies, or marveling at the thrillers that kept us on the edge of our seats. But tonight, I sensed something more in the air, something that made my skin prickle with anticipation. Alex was unusually quiet, his gaze often drifting from the screen to me, his expression unreadable. Every so often, he'd shift in his seat as if he was on the verge of saying something, but stopped himself each time. I tried to focus on the movie, on the storyline unraveling before us, but my attention kept shifting back to him. The space between us felt charged, like a storm building in the distance. "What's on your mind, Alex?" I asked, breaking the silence, hoping to bring things back to normal. He hesitated, his fingers running along the edge of the couch, his gaze fixed on his hands. "I guess I just feel like I don't really know what I'm doing with my life," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a vulnerability there, a rawness that took me off guard. I nodded, sensing that he needed to talk, that he was sharing more than just a passing worry. "That's normal at your age," I said, trying to reassure him. "You don't have to have it all figured out just yet." He looked up, his eyes locking onto mine with a quiet intensity. "But it's more than that," he murmured, his voice filled with something I couldn't quite place. "Sometimes I feel lost, like I don't really know who I am." His words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I felt a pang of something I couldn't explain, a desire to help him, to make him feel understood. I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder, offering a gentle squeeze. "You're not alone, Alex. We all feel that way sometimes." For a moment, he seemed to relax, his gaze softening as he looked at me. But then his expression changed, his brows furrowing as if he was battling an internal struggle. "Do you ever feel like there's something missing?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant, almost as if he was afraid of my answer. The question caught me off guard. I thought about it, about the quiet moments in my life when I'd felt an ache I couldn't name, a longing that never seemed to go away. I nodded slowly. "Yes, sometimes. I think everyone does." He took a breath, his hand reaching up to cover mine, his touch warm against my skin. "I just don't want to feel so alone anymore," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The air between us felt thick, filled with an unspoken tension that made my heart race. I wanted to say something to ease his worry, but the words wouldn't come. I could feel the weight of his hand on mine, the warmth spreading on my arm. Before I knew it, I was lost in the intensity of his gaze, drawn in by something I didn't understand. Without thinking, I leaned closer, my hand still on his shoulder, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't move, didn't pull away. Instead, he held my gaze, his eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and something deeper, something that made my breath catch. A soft knock on the door startled us both, breaking the spell. I pulled my hand back, clearing my throat as I forced a smile. "I'll get that," I said, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. As I walked to the door, I tried to shake off the lingering tension, the feeling of his hand on mine, the intensity in his eyes. I told myself it was just a moment, just a lapse in judgment that I'd read too much into. But as I opened the door and greeted the delivery driver, my mind kept drifting back to Alex, to the look in his eyes, the way he'd held my gaze. When I returned to the living room, he was standing by the window, his back to me, his posture tense. He didn't turn around as I entered, and I felt a pang of guilt as if I'd somehow crossed an invisible line. "I ordered us some food," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Hope you're hungry." He nodded, but didn't turn around. "Thanks," he said, his voice quiet, almost distant. I set the food down on the table, feeling a strange sense of discomfort, an unease that I couldn't shake. I tried to brush it off, to convince myself that it was all in my head, but the tension between us lingered, hanging in the air like a weight pressing down on my chest. That night, after Alex had gone to bed, I sat in the living room, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't escape. I kept replaying the moment over and over, the way his hand had covered mine, the look in his eyes, the unspoken connection that had passed between us. I wanted to convince myself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment of vulnerability, but a part of me couldn't let it go. The next morning, I was up early, hoping to shake off the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. I busied myself with breakfast, trying to distract myself with the familiar routine of cooking. But when Alex came downstairs, I felt my pulse quicken. The tension from the night before flooded back with a vengeance. He greeted me with a quiet smile, his expression guarded, as if he was unsure how to act. We ate in silence, the air between us thick with unspoken words. I tried to focus on my food, to pretend everything was normal, but I could feel his gaze on me, a weight I couldn't ignore. After breakfast, I suggested we go for a walk, hoping the fresh air would help clear the tension between us. He agreed, and we set off down the quiet neighborhood streets, the sounds of birds chirping filling the silence. For a while, we walked in comfortable quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. But eventually, he spoke up, his voice hesitant. "Uncle," he began, his tone uncertain. "About last night, I felt my heart skip a beat, but I kept my expression neutral, not wanting to give anything away." "It's okay, Alex," I said quickly, hoping to put his mind at ease. "We all have moments where we feel a little lost. You don't have to explain." He shook his head, stopping in his tracks, his gaze intense as he looked at me. "No, it's not that," he said, his voice filled with a determination I hadn't seen before. I don't know. I just feel like there's something I can't talk about, something I can't put into words." I turned to face him, feeling a strange mix of empathy and curiosity. "You can talk to me, Alex," I said softly. "Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone." For a moment, he looked at me, his expression filled with a kind of longing, a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder, offering a gentle squeeze. He held my gaze, his eyes searching mine, and in that moment, I felt something shift, something I couldn't deny. Without a word, he stepped closer, his face inches from mine, his gaze intense and unwavering. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The world around us faded as we stood there, caught in a moment that felt both surreal and inevitable. "I just don't want to feel alone anymore," he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet desperation. I felt a rush of emotions I couldn't explain, a desire to comfort him, to make him feel safe. I tightened my grip on his shoulder, offering a reassuring smile. "You're not alone, Alex. I'm here." He nodded, but didn't move, his gaze still locked on mine. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, the unspoken connection between us growing stronger with each passing second. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to wonder if this was more than just a fleeting feeling, if there was something deeper beneath the surface. But before I could say anything, he stepped back, a conflicted look in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to." I shook my head, offering a reassuring smile. "It's okay, Alex," I said gently. "You don't have to apologize." He nodded, but his expression remained troubled, as if he was grappling with something he couldn't quite understand. I wanted to reach out and tell him that everything would be okay, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, we stood there in silence, the tension between us lingering, unspoken but undeniable. As we walked back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that we had crossed an invisible line we couldn't uncross. The unspoken tension had grown, settling between us like a shadow, something we couldn't ignore no matter how hard we tried. The next few days felt like walking on thin ice. Every glance, every accidental touch seemed to deepen the unspoken connection between us. We were both careful, guarded, as though afraid of disturbing the delicate balance that had somehow settled between us. One evening, while I was tidying up the kitchen after dinner, Alex appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. His eyes were soft but intense. I felt my heart skip a beat, and a strange warmth spread through my chest. Something about the way he looked at me felt different, closer, more familiar. "You seem lost in thought," he said, his voice gentle. I shrugged, forcing a casual smile. "Just thinking about life, I guess. It has a way of surprising you when you least expect it." Alex took a step forward, closing the distance between us. "I know the feeling," he replied, his tone quiet, almost contemplative. He moved beside me, taking a towel and helping me dry the dishes without a word. There was a strange comfort in the silence, a feeling of closeness that I couldn't quite explain. The familiar tasks seemed to flow more naturally with him there, as though we were in sync in a way that went beyond words. At one point, our hands brushed, and I felt a surge of warmth spread up my arm, an electric current that made my heart race. I expected him to pull away, to pretend it was just an accident, but he didn't. Instead, he looked up, his gaze meeting mine with a quiet intensity that made the air between us feel thick, charged with something I couldn't name. "You're important to me," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. "More than I think you realize." I felt a pang of emotion, a warmth that spread through my chest and settled there, filling the empty spaces I hadn't even known existed. I wanted to say something to express the strange connection I felt, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken bond we shared. After a moment, he turned away, setting the towel down and heading toward the living room. I followed, my mind still reeling from the quiet intensity of his words. We settled onto the couch. The familiar hum of the TV filled the silence between us, but tonight, the usual comfort of our evening ritual felt different, closer, more intimate. The room was dim, the only light coming from the TV screen, casting soft shadows across his face. I found myself watching him out of the corner of my eye, noticing the way his expression softened in the glow of the screen, the way his features seemed to relax, as though he too felt the comfort of our unspoken connection. After a while, he turned to me, his expression thoughtful. Have you ever felt like you were searching for something, but didn't know what it was? The question took me off guard. I looked at him, caught by the quiet vulnerability in his gaze. Yes, I replied, my voice soft. I think everyone feels that way sometimes. He nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. I feel like there's something here, something I can't ignore. My heart skipped a beat, a mixture of anticipation and fear swirling in my chest. I didn't know how to respond, didn't know how to navigate the unfamiliar territory we seemed to be treading. But before I could say anything, he leaned closer, his face inches from mine, his gaze intense and unwavering. For a brief moment, we were frozen, caught in a surreal and inevitable moment. His breath was warm and steady against my skin, my heart pounding in my chest as the tension between us thickened with each passing second. Then, slowly, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a gentle, hesitant kiss. It was soft, almost tentative, as though he was testing the waters, waiting to see if I would pull away. But I didn't. I felt myself responding, my body moving of its own accord, drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain. The kiss deepened, growing more confident, and I felt a rush of warmth spreading through me, filling every corner of my being. His hands moved to my shoulders, steadying me, and I melted into the moment, letting go of the reservations that had held me back for so long. We couldn't control ourselves. Everything that happened between us felt inevitable. Our bodies met, wrapping around each other, melting into the emotions that swirled between us. For those few fleeting seconds, nothing else existed but the warmth of his touch, the softness of his lips, the quiet intensity that bound us together. It was a feeling unlike anything I'd ever experienced, a mixture of comfort and exhilaration, a sense of belonging that went beyond words. When we finally pulled away, he looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. I could see the questions in his gaze, the silent hesitation that mirrored my own. We probably shouldn't have done that. I murmured, my voice shaky, though a part of me didn't believe it. He looked down, his expression thoughtful. Maybe, he replied quietly, but it didn't feel wrong. There was a silence, heavy and thick, filled with the weight of everything left unsaid. I wanted to argue, to insist that we should stop, that we were treading dangerous ground, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself reaching out, my hand covering his in a silent gesture of reassurance. We sat there in silence, the warmth of his hand beneath mine a steady comfort, a reminder of the quiet bond we shared. I knew we were walking a line, crossing boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, but I couldn't bring myself to pull away. Not now, not after everything we'd shared. After a moment, he spoke, his voice soft. I don't want to lose this, whatever this is. I don't want to feel alone anymore. His words struck a chord deep within me, stirring feelings I hadn't acknowledged, emotions I hadn't allowed myself to feel. I tightened my grip on his hand, my heart aching with a strange mix of fear and longing. You're not alone, Alex, I said quietly. I'm here. He nodded, his gaze softening, a hint of relief crossing his face. We sat there in silence, our hands intertwined, the quiet understanding between us a steady anchor in the midst of the uncertainty. For the rest of the evening, we stayed close, neither of us daring to speak, afraid that words might shatter the fragile connection we'd built. The silence was comfortable, filled with the unspoken promises we hadn't yet voiced, the quiet understanding that went beyond words. When he finally stood to head upstairs, he paused, his gaze meeting mine. Good night, he murmured, his voice soft. Good night, I replied, my heart heavy with emotions I couldn't name. As I watched him disappear down the hallway, a part of me knew that nothing would be the same. We'd crossed a line, one we couldn't uncross, and I wasn't sure what the future held. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a strange sense of peace, a feeling of belonging that went beyond anything I'd ever known. The next morning, an unusual quietness settled over the house. I awoke early, my mind still buzzing with thoughts from the night before. Memories of the kiss, his touch, and the warmth we shared lingered, filling my thoughts with a mixture of wonder and unease. I knew we were navigating dangerous ground, that we had crossed into something fragile and complex, but I also knew that I couldn't ignore what had happened. Pretending it didn't exist felt impossible. I found Alex in the kitchen, already awake, staring out the window as if lost in thought. The early morning light cast a soft glow across his face, highlighting the gentle lines of his expression, the quiet intensity in his gaze. He didn't seem to notice me at first, so absorbed in his own thoughts that he didn't even hear me enter the room. I hesitated, unsure of how to approach him, wondering if he felt the same confusion, the same questions that had kept me awake through the night. "Morning," I said finally, my voice soft. He turned, his eyes meeting mine with a look I couldn't quite decipher. "Morning," he replied, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. There was a warmth in his gaze, a quiet reassurance that settled some of my unease, though I could still feel the weight of everything left unsaid lingering between us. We shared a simple breakfast, the silence comfortable though neither of us mentioned the night before. But as we sat across from each other, I could feel the unspoken bond between us, the quiet understanding that needed no words. For a while, it was enough, and we fell into a gentle rhythm, sharing small smiles and lingering glances, a silent acknowledgement of the connection we couldn't deny. The rest of the day passed in much the same way. We found ways to fill the time with chores around the house, a walk around the neighborhood, simple conversations about the future. It was a strange feeling, balancing on the edge of something so profound, yet feeling a sense of peace in each other's presence, as if we had discovered a part of ourselves we hadn't known was missing. But as evening approached, a sense of finality settled over me. I knew that we couldn't continue like this, that eventually we would have to face reality, to confront the consequences of our choices. The thought made my chest ache, a quiet sadness settling in the pit of my stomach. I didn't want to lose this, didn't want to lose him, but I knew that we couldn't keep living in this fragile bubble forever. That night, as we sat together in the living room, a comfortable silence filling the space between us, he turned to me, his gaze filled with a quiet determination. "Uncle, I don't know what happens next, but I know that I don't want to lose what we have." I looked at him, feeling a mixture of pride and sadness, knowing that he too was struggling with the same questions, the same doubts. "Alex," I began, my voice soft and steady, "whatever happens, you'll never be alone. You'll always have me in your life." He nodded, a small, grateful smile crossing his face, but I could see the sadness in his eyes, the unspoken understanding that this moment, this fragile connection, couldn't last forever. We were both walking a line, balancing on the edge of something that could easily fall apart, but neither of us was ready to let go. For a moment, we sat in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, wrestling with the emotions we hadn't allowed ourselves to feel. And then, almost instinctively, he reached out, his hand covering mine in a gesture of quiet reassurance. I felt a warmth spread through me, a sense of comfort in his touch, a silent promise that no matter what happened, we would always be there for each other. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible but filled with a quiet intensity that made my heart ache. I gave his hand a gentle squeeze, a silent acknowledgement of everything we couldn't say, everything we couldn't put into words. We stayed like that for a while, the warmth of his hand in mine a steady anchor in the midst of the uncertainty, a reminder of the bond we shared, the connection that went beyond words. Eventually, he let go, standing up to head to bed, a soft smile on his lips as he wished me good night. I watched him disappear down the hallway, a mixture of emotions swirling in my chest, a quiet sadness settling over me as I realized that somehow this chapter was coming to an end. That night, as I lay in bed, memories of the past few days flooded my mind. The quiet moments, the shared smiles, the unspoken promises. I knew that we had shared something unique, something that had changed both of us. But I also knew that we couldn't stay in this place forever. Life would move on, time would pass, and eventually we would have to face the reality of our choices. In the days that followed, Alex grew quieter, more introspective, as though he too was coming to terms with the end of something beautiful and fleeting. We continued our routines, sharing meals, taking walks, spending quiet evenings together, but there was a new sense of distance between us, a gentle understanding that we were both preparing to let go. On his last night at the house, we sat together in the living room, the silence filled with a sense of nostalgia, a quiet acknowledgement of everything we had shared. He turned to me, his expression soft, a hint of sadness in his gaze. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. "For everything. For being here. For understanding." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat and an ache in my chest as I realized that this was truly goodbye. "You'll always have a place here, Alex," I replied, my voice steady though I could feel the weight of emotion pressing down on me. "No matter where life takes you, you'll always be family." He gave a small, grateful smile, a glimmer of relief crossing his face as he reached out, pulling me into a hug. It was a simple gesture, but it felt profound, a silent expression of everything we couldn't say, everything we couldn't put into words. We held each other for a moment, the warmth of his embrace a steady comfort, a reminder of the bond we shared, the connection that went beyond words. And then, slowly, he pulled away, his gaze meeting mine one last time. "Goodbye, Uncle," he murmured, his voice soft, filled with a quiet sadness that mirrored my own. "Goodbye, Alex," I replied, my voice steady though my heart felt heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. As he walked out the door, I felt a sense of loss settle over me, a quiet sadness that I couldn't quite explain. But beneath the sadness, there was a sense of peace, a quiet understanding that we had shared something unique, something that had changed both of us in ways we couldn't yet understand. For a long time after he left, I sat alone in the quiet house, memories of our time together filling the empty spaces. I thought about the unspoken promises, the quiet moments, the shared smiles, and I realized that in some way, we had both found something we hadn't known we were searching for. We had found a connection, a sense of belonging, a bond that went beyond the boundaries of family. A quiet understanding that would stay with us even as life moved on. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself reflecting on our time together, the quiet moments, the shared smiles, the silent promises we hadn't voiced. Though we had gone our separate ways, though life had moved on, I knew that the memory of those moments, the quiet connection we had shared, would stay with me. A gentle reminder of the fleeting beauty of life, of the connections that shape us, that change us in ways we can't always understand. In the end, I realized that our time together, however brief, had left a lasting impact, a quiet mark on my heart that would stay with me for the rest of my life. And as I moved forward, carrying the memory of those days with me, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet contentment in knowing that in some way, he would always be a part of me, a part of my story, a part of my life that would never truly fade. Thank you so much for watching this emotional and touching story. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt LGBT stories. Don't forget to leave a comment below and share your thoughts on this story. Your support means the world to us. Until next time, take care and stay connected.